Hey guys! Tonight we're easing into something wonderfully uneventful, mildly tragic, and historically questionable. So if you've been looking for a reason to dim the lights, settle into the softest pillow you own, and listen to a calm monologue about centuries of royals making disturbingly bad marriage decisions, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop and welcome to another sleepy drift through the quiet disasters of the past. Tonight, we're exploring the most inbred monarchs in European history because nothing says bedtime relaxation quite like the slow collapse of royal gene pools over hundreds of years. European aristocrats spent so many generations marrying their cousins, nieces, siblings, and the occasional mysteriously related stranger that by the end, most dynasties were basically a genetic recycling project. Of course, they insisted it was all in the name of dynastic purity, which is medieval for, we don't want to share our toys, so we're going to marry within the family until someone grows an extra chin. And yes, many of them did. So nestle in. Maybe keep a glass of water nearby. Try not to think too hard about how every royal portrait you've ever seen is essentially a medical warning label. Tonight we're gliding gently, very gently, into one of the world's most unfortunate family trees, the House of Habsburg. Because if we're talking inbreeding, we might as well start with the dynasty that basically turned it into an Olympic sport. Let's drift into the Habsburg fog. The Habsburgs were, for centuries, the power players of Europe. They had more crowns than functional jawlines, more titles than healthy offspring, and they controlled everything from the sunny hills of Spain to chunks of Central Europe that even the maps got tired of labeling. And like many medieval family power, they were absolutely terrified of letting outsiders into the bloodline. So they married cousins, and more cousins, and those cousins were also cousins to other cousins. It was like one of those chaotic family WhatsApp groups where everyone is technically related, but nobody remembers how. Except instead of forwarding memes, they forwarded genetic disorders. So to ease you into this, we're starting with one of the more manageable Habsburgs, someone who wasn't a complete biological train wreck, though he was certainly warming up the track for the next generations. Let's meet Philip I of Castile, also known as Philip the Handsome. And yes, that nickname was extremely optimistic. Philip the Handsome, the mildly attractive beginning of the end. Philip the Handsome was born in 1498 in Bruges. Back when Bruges was slightly less of a tourist amusement park and slightly more of a medieval traffic jam of guilds, merchants, and market smells. His parents were Maximilian I of Habsburg and Mary of Burgundy, two people who looked perfectly normal for a pair of nobles, which is to say, a bit stiff, slightly malnourished, and always on the verge of an arranged marriage they weren't super thrilled about. Philip inherited the best traits he was ever going to get. He wasn't spectacular, but compared to later Habsburgs, some of whom had faces that looked like geometry problems, he was practically a Renaissance heartthrob. Handsome might have been a stretch, but presentable with good lighting definitely fit. Now, Philip's life was shaped by a familiar Habsburg motto. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. They really lived by this. They married so much that historians sometimes refer to the family as the family that diplomatically seduced Europe, which is a gentle way of saying they kept marrying their neighbors until all their neighbors were also their cousins. Philip's major dynastic duty came in 1496 when he married Joanna of Castile, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Yes, the same Isabella who financed Columbus, proving that she sometimes made decisions even worse than her family's marriage policies. This union was a political jackpot. Spain was on the rise. The Habsburgs wanted influence. The Spanish royals wanted connections, and everyone wanted Philip to stop flirting with the maids long enough to say, "I do." So he did. And unfortunately for Joanna, he kept flirting anyway. Joanna of Castile, the woman who deserved better but married a Habsburg. Joanna, later known as Joanna the Mad, was not actually mad in the sense medieval gossip loved to insist she was. She was more emotionally overwhelmed, chronically neglected, and married to a man who treated monogamy like it was an optional side quest. Her marriage to Philip was passionate at first. She adored him with the kind of intense, slightly unhealthy devotion that medieval poets would have written way too many verses about. But Philip, being Philip, preferred to spend quality time with every woman in the palace except his wife. This naturally drove Joanna into spirals of heartbreak. And given the era where female emotions were considered a medical emergency, her perfectly understandable reactions were labeled as madness. Philip, meanwhile, barely noticed. He was busy being charming, mediocre, and politically important. But together they produced children. Many children. Children who would fuel the Habsburg dynasty for centuries, and also inherit every genetic problem their grandchildren would later become very famous for. Among these children was Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor, who would eventually become peak Habsburg. But we'll get back to him in another part. For now, back to Philip. Philip's most impressive skill was dying inconveniently early. In 1506, Philip died suddenly at the age of 28. Officially, he died of a fever. Unofficially, rumors spread that he played a strenuous game of tennis in the heat, then immediately chugged cold water like it was medieval Gatorade and sent himself into shock. Which is bizarre enough to be true because these people were constantly trying to invent new ways to die unnecessarily. His death left Joanna devastated, as in refusing to let his body go devastated. She famously traveled with his corpse for months, which everyone interpreted as proof of her insanity. Honestly, it was probably more proof that she was grieving in a world that offered her zero emotional support, and also zero therapy. But Philip's legacy lived on in his offspring, one of whom would become the most powerful ruler in Europe, and another who would become the unfortunate genetic foundation of Spain's most infamous monarch. Charles II, the Bewitched, the medically improbable, the Habsburg jaw's final masterpiece. But we're not drifting to Charles II just yet. That level of inbreeding deserves its own sleepy descent later. For now, let's float further into the Habsburg DNA swamp by gliding over to Philip's son, someone who made the dynasty richer, larger, and significantly more complicated. But before we continue, take a moment. Stretch your fingers, adjust your blanket if you need to, because our next figure is a long, steady march into everything that made the Habsburgs the Habsburgs. Let's drift over to the man who inherited multiple kingdoms, tried to rule half the planet, and aged like someone who spent 24 hours a day stressed about how many cousins he was married to by extension. Charles I of Spain, or Charles V of Holy Roman Emperor, was born in 1500. And right away you could tell he was destined to have more titles than personal hobbies. Thanks to his grandparents' aggressive dynasty collecting, Charles inherited territory from 4 different royal houses: Burgundy, Castile, Aragon, the Habsburg line itself, all blending into one big empire that was both impressive and, for Charles, probably exhausting. Imagine being 15 years old and suddenly becoming king of Spain, a country you had never actually lived in, where the people spoke a language you didn't understand, and where your advisors kept reminding you that the economy was hanging together by whatever the medieval equivalent of duct tape was. Charles didn't even arrive prepared. He showed up speaking French accented Dutch, dressed like a Flemish noble, and immediately passed out government jobs to his friends back home. Spain was unimpressed. And can we blame them? Their new king had the energy of a foreign exchange student who accidentally won an entire peninsula in a raffle. But Charles tried. Slowly. Awkwardly. Very Habsburgly. Let's glide quietly through his situation. The physical hallmark of Habsburg inbreeding begins